Hi there, everyone. So I'm back again with another video about the case of Madeleine McCann, and I really appreciate all the support that I have received on the previous two videos that I've done about this case. Um, I've really realized that there is so much to go into with this case. I'm probably going to make a total of three more videos about the case, including this one. But in this video specifically, I want to focus on the evidence of the sniffer dogs, Eddy and Keela, and the DNA evidence. And I just want to have a bit of a detailed discussion about that because really in this case, in the absence of any sort of body or in the absence of any um, real solid and tangible physical evidence. The evidence of the sniffer dogs and the DNA evidence is really the strongest evidence that we have to go on when formulating a theory. And I will just reiterate that's all that I'm doing in these videos. I don't believe that there is enough evidence at our disposal to know what exactly happened to Madeleine. Um, I think the best that we can really do with what we have available is come to some generalizations about what probably happened. But there really just isn't enough for us to make any definite pronouncements, so I'm not going to attempt to do that. Here and there, I might offer statements about what I believe probably happened, but they are just my own opinion based on my interpretation of the evidence. And of course, nobody in this case has been found guilty of anything. And so it's all just speculation and opinion at this point. And of course, you are free to come to your own conclusions. There's certainly room for a lot of different theories and interpretations in this case. But I just thought it'd be interesting to look at the evidence of the sniffer dogs and the DNA evidence because, in my opinion, this is really the most scientific evidence that we have in this case. And I think this evidence really allows us to get an idea about certain aspects of the case with sort of a greater degree of accuracy. So a little bit of background. Eddy and Keela were, as I mentioned in previous videos, they were sniffer dogs from the UK, very, very highly regarded. They had helped police to crack many cases before working on the Madeleine McCann case, and their success rate was extremely high. They were Springer Spaniels, trained from when they were puppies to detect the scent of human cadaver, so human decomposing body, and human blood. Okay, and their trainer, Martin Grime, had trained them to signal or alert when they detected those smells. Okay, so Eddy and Keela were brought in by the Portuguese police just because at the stage that Eddy and Keela were brought in, the Portuguese police were working on the idea that there was some sort of foul play within the McCanns and their friends, that group of the Tapas Nine. And so these dogs were brought in with their handler from the UK. And there were a number of areas that the dogs investigated in order to see whether they could pick up the scents that they'd been trained to find. So Eddy is the cadaver sniffing dog and Keela is the blood sniffing dog. And I think before we look at exactly what Eddy and Keela found, I just want to mention something that is brought up on the Maddie podcast. And the Maddie podcast, again, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's very relevant to the topic that we're talking about today. But the Maddie podcast points out that the evidence of sniffer dogs, what sniffer dogs find, is not admissible in court. And I think that's for obvious reasons. Sniffer dogs can get things wrong. It's worth noting Eddy and Keela specifically, as I say, have an extremely good track record, but the evidence of sniffer dogs is not verifiable enough that the law has caught up to the point where they will admit sniffer dog evidence in court. Sniffer dogs are really just brought in to show the police where to look. They're not brought in to prove anything exactly. They're brought in more like just pointers, almost like maps for the police to say, okay, well, investigate this area further because the dogs picked up on something. And that's exactly what the Portuguese police did, as we'll see when we look at the reports. So Eddy and Keela were brought in and they examined a few different areas. They examined the apartment 5A where the McCanns stayed during that holiday. They examined the apartments of the McCann's friends. And they also examined the area around the McCann's apartments, so like the gardens and the just the sort of outside of the apartment. And then the dogs were also brought in to examine a number of cars in a parking lot, of which the McCann's rental car was one. And then the final place where the dogs were brought in to examine was the McCann's villa in Praia de Luz, which was where they stayed after they moved out of the apartment. So the McCanns stayed in Praia de Luz for several months after Maddie's disappearance, and they rented a villa, and the sniffer dogs were also brought into this villa to see what they could pick up. So we're going to have a look at the PJ report, so the Portuguese police report that they compiled detailing the sniffer dog evidence. Let me just pull it up. Give me a sec. Right, okay. Move myself over a wee bit. Okay, so we won't read the entire thing because it's pretty detailed. I don't want to put you guys to sleep, but we'll just kind of go over the main points. So the dog inspection report of cars searched in subterranean garage. Okay, so a number of cars were parked in an underground garage. The McCann's rental car, remember I spoke about the rental car in my previous video. The McCann's rental car was one of the cars that was parked in the garage, but there were several other cars for those of you who don't know. So it wasn't just the McCann's car, because I think it's pretty obvious if it was only the McCann's car, that would kind of bias the inspection a little bit. There were other cars as well, and they just wanted to kind of verify the evidence of the dogs. The McCann's car was just one of the cars. There were several cars. And those cars were an Opel Corsa, Fiat Punto, Peugeot 205, Renault Scenic, that was the McCann's car, Skoda Fabia, VW Transporter, Nissan Patrol, VW Passat, Audi A4, and Renault Kangoo. Okay, so there were, gosh, like 10 cars, if I'm not mistaken, that were parked in this parking lot. So the dog Eddy, that detects cadaver odor, examining the whole level of the underground car park where the vehicles were parked. So I've seen the video of Eddy inspecting these cars. I'm not going to play it in my video here, but you can check it out. It's on YouTube. So Martin Grime takes Eddy around each car individually just to see if Eddy shows signs of picking up any scent of cadaver. So Eddy is the cadaver sniffing dog. And from what I can tell and from Martin Grime's explanation, when Eddy kind of picks up the scent, he starts to get really excitable and he sort of starts to run in circles. And then it's up to the handler to try and kind of pin him down and get him to signal more exactly where he's picking up the cadaver odor. Because I imagine dogs' noses are extremely sensitive and they can probably, you know, sniff the scent in the air, but obviously for the purposes of the police work, they want to know exactly where the cadaver odor is coming from. And so that's where Martin Grimes comes in. And he's very, very skilled at doing that. So examined the whole level of the underground car park where the vehicles were parked. it having been verified the following result. The dog marked car number 4, the Renault Scenic, the rental car currently used by Jerry and Kate McCann. Okay, so Eddy was taken around all the other cars, didn't mark any of them except for the Renault Scenic, which was the car used by Jerry and Kate. So after that, they moved the Renault Scenic to parking level -3, subjected to an expert examination. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to have some water. By officers from the police science laboratory. And another canine inspection began a little bit later by the dog Keela. So actually what happens is Eddy marks the car by alerting to the doors of the Renault Scenic. And we hear Martin Grimes explaining that, sorry, I don't actually know if his name is Grime or Grimes. I think I'm 99% sure it's Grime. But we hear Martin Grime explaining that the scent of the cadaver odor is actually coming through the doors. And so Eddy is alerting to the doors of the car, and they don't actually take Eddy inside the car because it's sufficient that he has picked up the scent of cadaver odor just simply emanating out of the car. And then they bring in Keela, who's the blood sniffing dog, to see whether she can pinpoint more specifically where the police should be looking in the car. So Keela's brought in and verifies the following result. The dog marked an area of the lower right hand, an area of the lower right hand side of the interior part of the baggage compartment of the car. So the lower right hand side of the boot of the car. Keela alerts to that area. She also marks an area called the tidy compartment. I imagine this is the glove compartment in the front of the car. And this was found to contain the car key. So it's a little plastic electronic card key type with the key ring of the budget rental company. So in order to confirm that the dog had effectively marked the car key, I suppose they just wanted to confirm that that's what she was actually alerting to, the key. The key was moved to and concealed in a place far away from the vehicle in a sandbox. And then a bit later, a new inspection was performed by Eddy, and he also marked the sandbox, which is where the key was concealed. So they used the two dogs to sort of verify each other's that they were both picking up on the same areas. So they didn't bring them both in at once, which I think, you know, makes sense. You don't want dogs to kind of be influenced by one another. They would bring them in separately so they could verify the evidence a little bit more kind of precisely, which I think is really awesome and really interesting. Okay, so Eddy alerted to the car as a whole. Keela alerted to the glove compartment and the boot of the car. Right, so then they did a search of the area near apartment 5A with Eddy. So the area surrounding certain roads close to apartment 5A. The whole activity was filmed, and Eddy, who detects cadaver odor, did not signal anything in those areas around the apartment. Okay. So then they brought in Eddy inside apartment 5A. I think it's so interesting they bring in Eddy first by the looks of it, and then Keela is brought in later. So Eddy is kind of probably more used to just find out if there's anything there that's worth exploring further, and then Keela's brought in maybe to narrow the search down a little bit. So then they looked inside apartment 5A. On this date, a new inspection was carried out in the apartment mentioned above with Keela, who detects human blood remains. and this produced the following results. The dog marked an area of tiles in the living room next to the window and behind the blue sofa. So we talked about that in the last video. And she also marked the lower part of the left white colored curtain of the window behind the sofa. Okay, so that area behind the blue sofa has been a cause for a lot of kind of speculation. Right. So inspections were conducted in the apartments occupied by members of the McCann family, as well as the group who were with them at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. It was only on that date that the apartment, identified as that of the parents, was empty, allowing further investigation, which was authorized by the respective occupants. Okay, so all the McCanns and all their friends gave permission for these inspections to take place. I think that's important to point out. But if they hadn't, I think that would have looked very suspicious, wouldn't it? So, okay, so Eddy was taken into apartment 5A, which is where the McCanns were staying. The cadaver dog, Eddy, marks the couple's wardrobe area in the bedroom. So if you look at the video, you can see exactly where Eddy marks. It's a wardrobe inside Kate and Jerry's bedroom. And he also marks an area behind the sofa in the sitting room near the window overlooking the road. So it's the same area where Keela had marked. All right, and we've also already talked about what Keela found. So apartment 5B, which is where other members of the Tapas, I forget who exactly stayed in which of these apartments, but these other 4 apartments were other members of the Tapas 9 group. So in 5B, the cadaver dog did not alert on anything. 5D, Eddy didn't alert on anything. 5H, Eddy didn't alert on anything. And 4G, Eddy didn't alert on anything. The garden belonging to apartment 5A, so the McCann's apartment garden, Eddy marked an area of the garden immediately below the window. Interesting. Okay. So then the dogs were taken around various areas of the Ocean Club village and various roads to see if they could pick up any scent in any of these areas in the Ocean Club village. And you can see them listed here, numbers 1 to 4. I'm not going to go through them, but the dogs didn't find anything in the rest of the Ocean Club village, or what those areas where they were taken. So then the report says, faced with new elements revealed by the dog handling unit's search attached to the report, and on the basis of Mark Harrison's report, there is every reason to believe that the small child, Madeleine McCann, died in apartment 5A where she was spending her holiday with her parents at the Ocean Club in Praia da Luz. Following the markings by the cadaver odor detecting dog, and traces of human blood inside the apartment from which the child disappeared, we have done further extensive research revealing that there was never a death or a body notified in the same apartment before. So they established that there was no other occupants of the apartment who could have been responsible for these alerts that the dogs made. There weren't any other deaths or suspicious circumstances that had ever happened in that apartment before. It was only the case of Madeleine McCann that could have been responsible for where the dogs alerted. So it follows from this investigation that there are indications in practice and in the facts of the crime of murder, such as defined in a certain aspect of Portuguese law. So I think that's interesting. It's kind of a leap at this point to say that it was murder. All you really have at this stage is evidence of a death. Murder is something, a step further. Murder involves, an intentional crime being committed, which I don't know how they could have said that at this point, but anyway, this is what's in the report. Then the report says, so as to go further with this lead, of which certain results may reveal new evidence, we request authorization to carry out further inspections within the legal framework in two distinct places. The McCann's current residence in Portugal and the rented vehicle Renault Scenic. Okay, so we've already looked at where the dogs alerted to the Renault Scenic. Now let's have a look at where they're alerted to in the McCann's villa in Praia de Luz. Okay. So, within the context of a residential search carried out at the McCann couple's current residence, an inspection by a dog handling team was made. Thus, at the time indicated at the beginning of the report, all areas of the property were inspected and the following results obtained. The dog Eddy, who detects cadaver odors, marked the area of a cupboard in the living room. On checking, the dog was indicating a pink soft toy belonging to Madeleine McCann. So that's Cuddle Cat. If you guys are familiar with the case, you know that Madeleine had a soft cat toy called Cuddle Cat, and Eddy, the cadaver sniffing dog, alerted to this toy. On that date, following the home visit made to the McCann's current residence, various items of clothing were laid out in an appropriate place for this purpose to carry out an inspection by the dog handling unit. The items of clothing were set out individually with the agreement and under directions provided by the British technicians, the dogs having previously covered the space where the clothing was laid out. So they had already gone over the area where the clothes were laid out. Before laying out the clothes, they'd gone over the area with the dogs just to make sure that the area itself didn't have any of the odors that the dogs were looking for, so that they could be certain that it was the clothes. If the dogs alerted to the clothes, that it was the clothes they were alerting to and not the room in general. So they'd already checked the area before laying out the clothes, and there was nothing signaled by the dogs. Okay, an initial inspection by the human blood detecting dog began with clothing packed in the box bearing the notation living room. The inspection was completed without the dog showing anything abnormal. The canine human remains recovery dog, so Eddy, started its inspection and marked various clothes. The clothes were then returned to their box for later use, and you can see photographs of exactly which clothes were marked. If you look online, I believe they are in the PJ files as well, but it was various items of Madeleine's clothes. I believe there was some of Kate's clothes that the dogs marked. So all the other boxes containing clothing from the twins' bedroom, from the friend's bedroom, from the bedroom of the couple, as well as the empty luggage, was inspected by the two dogs without conclusive results. Okay. So then Robert Murat's house was also inspected by the dogs. We won't go into that because the dogs didn't find anything in his house. He was a suspect at one point, but the dogs weren't able to pick up any of the smells that they were looking for in his house, so we won't go into that too much. Okay, so based on where the dogs alerted, the Portuguese police collected some DNA evidence from the various areas that were where the dogs alerted to. So there were samples collected from the floor, samples collected from the wall, samples from behind the sofa, samples from the blue curtain, and samples from the white curtain behind the blue curtain. All of these elements have been handed over to Birmingham Forensic Science Services. So I spoke about FSS in the previous video. They were the British lab that was tasked with analyzing the DNA evidence that was collected. So let's have a look at what DNA evidence was collected. So from the Renault Scenic, from the driver's side hair, fiber and hairs, fingernail, from the passenger side hair, fibers, fingernail, between the seats, hair and fibers, from the back seat, the center seat, right-hand seat, luggage compartment, so the boot. So it's hair, fibers, and it seems like bits of nail as well that were collected from the car for analysis. Um, okay, so all of those samples of DNA were forwarded to the Oh, excuse me. I'm still getting the hang of this software. Um, all of those DNA samples were collected from those areas based on the alerts of the dogs, and they were sent to the FSS for analysis. Um, and the results came back from the FSS inconclusive, which really didn't help the police investigation to advance any further. But we need to remember this was a British lab. The FSS was a British lab. This was back in 2007. Their methods of analyzing DNA were really quite primitive compared to what's available today and compared to what they have in certain labs elsewhere in the world. Like there's a very advanced lab in the United States called cybergenetics. We're going to look at that in a moment. And then there's another lab in New Zealand called StarMix. And these two labs have much, much more advanced methods of analyzing DNA evidence than what the FSS were using. So if you listen to the Maddie podcast, there's the journalist who does the podcast interviews an expert called Mark Perlin. And he explains how it was almost inevitable that the results from the FSS analysis were going to come back inconclusive because of how basic and primitive the methods were that they were using. So let's go over to the FSS report. Again, it's pretty long and we're not going to look at the whole thing. But I just want to give you an idea of what these results said. So we looked at the various bits of DNA evidence that were collected based on where the dogs alerted, and they were sent to the FSS for analysis. And what we see is, if we just skim this report, I'm not gonna read it in detail, as I say, but we see the same comments coming up over and over again. The DNA appeared to be from at least 3 persons that was too complex to permit a meaningful interpretation. No proof that supports the theory that any member of the McCann family had contributed DNA to these results. Absence of sufficient good quality DNA. Object not adequate to perform DNA profile tests. Absence of sufficient good quality DNA. So too meager to permit a meaningful interpretation. These are the sorts of comments that come up over and over again in this FSS support. The absence of sufficient good quality DNA. Not adequate to perform DNA profile tests. This whole report is really frustrating to read because we just see over and over again that the analysis of these DNA samples, aside from a few here and there where the FSS said, okay, these samples indicate that they are most likely from the McCann family, most of the results from this report are just simply inconclusive. Basically, the FSS saying that they can't really meaningfully analyze the DNA that was sent to them because the DNA is not strong enough, it's too complex, meaning there are too many contributors to the sample, or it's to the DNA evidence is too weak. So it's really just very, very vague and really can't tell us anything if we just look at the FSS report. But Mark Perlin, as I mentioned, he makes it clear that the methods that the FSS were using were really very basic. And using cutting edge DNA analysis technology that we have today in the likes of Mark Perlin's lab, cybergenetics, his true allele technology, he would be able to analyze even very complex DNA samples where there are multiple contributors to the DNA sample. He can analyze DNA samples that are very small. So some of the DNA collected by the Portuguese police was very weak. And just a side note on that, I think I need to mention at this point that there is a comment by one of the police officers on the case that they believe that the reason why the DNA evidence is so weak, or some of these DNA samples are so weak, is because the crime scene had been cleaned. There's reference to the crime scene having been very thoroughly cleaned and possibly even, scrubbed and bleached, and that left DNA that was very kind of small and weak left over for the Portuguese police to analyze. So that is suggestive, I think, that, the crime scene was cleaned. And so the DNA evidence that they were able to collect was that DNA that had kind of like slipped into the cracks of the tiles and into the fibers of the curtains, and hadn't been able to be cleaned off. But it was very small and pretty meager, as the report says. And now I just want to look at what Mark Perlin has said about the DNA evidence. So I want to go over to an article by 9news.com.au. And this is the Australian news broadcaster that put out the Maddie podcast, which I really can't recommend highly enough. Okay, so let's have a look at this article. Exclusive Maddie's DNA possibly in car boot. Top US scientist has key to unlock baffling McCann forensic riddle. 11 years ago, a UK forensics lab, so that's the FSS, hit a frustrating dead end in the Madeleine McCann case when a team of its best scientists were unable to unravel potentially critical DNA evidence. It was evidence which could have worked out if the missing British girl's DNA was in the boot of a rental car hired by her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, 25 days after she was reported missing on May 3rd, 2007. At the time, those DNA samples were judged inconclusive by a UK lab, the Forensic Science Service. But now one of the leading DNA scientists in the world, Dr. Mark Perlin, has claimed he needs just 1 week to crack those once indecipherable samples, including the swabs taken from the boot compartment of that hire car. Dr. Perlin said it was possible Madeleine's DNA was present in the McCann hire car, potentially opening up a line of the police inquiry that was seemingly shut down by the 2007 inconclusive DNA results. So these inconclusive DNA results by the FSS really just put a major spanner in the works of the investigation that the Portuguese police were working on. They really couldn't advance any further because of the inconclusive results. The theory that they were working on couldn't be proved because the results were inconclusive. So the article goes on to say, what was interesting about the report from the FSS 10 years ago is they're trying to interpret the McCann DNA data, Dr. Perlin said. The approach the FSS would like to take for a match statistic makes sense, but the way they are going about it is just very old-fashioned and it doesn't work, certainly compared with modern methods. Dr. Perlin's powerful DNA testing software, widely regarded as the most sophisticated on the planet, is a quantum leap ahead of the forensic science used in 2007 when the McCann samples were tested. The chief scientist of US-based cybergenetics, Dr. Perlin, said the UK lab that conducted the DNA tests failed when it returned a series of inconclusive results to Portuguese police. So Mark Perlin has looked at the report of the FSS, and he said, this really isn't satisfactory. It's not enough for them to say that this DNA evidence is inconclusive, because with the methods we have available now, he could very likely and potentially solve these DNA samples and tell us exactly whose DNA, was in these samples using his more advanced methods. And Mark Perlin also has a really, illustrious career as a DNA expert. He's helped the police in America to solve a lot of cases. And so he's incredibly highly regarded. He's at the top of his field. It's not like he's just some quack. He's, the absolute world leading expert on DNA analysis. So he says, what this FSS report says is there is a possibility that Madeleine McCann's DNA is present in this mixture. Dr. Perlin, who 9.com.au, sent a copy of the FSS DNA report, which was handed to Portuguese police in September 2007. Interviewed exclusively in the 5th episode of Maddie, 9.com.au's podcast investigation into Madeleine's disappearance, Dr. Perlin explained how the limited testing methods used by the FSS in the McCann case were doomed to fail. He stated the raft of DNA samples deemed inconclusive by the FSS may hold significant case-changing information. So within those samples could actually be the key to unlocking what happened to Madeleine. It could rule out Kate and Jerry, or it could confirm that they, were somehow responsible. It could confirm whether Madeleine died in that apartment, or whether she didn't. It's depending on how the results of Mark Perlin's testing potentially play out. We could learn a lot about the crime scene. So Dr. Perlin also said the older FSS testing methods in 2007 were subjective and open to human bias. Well, we see plenty of human bias in the Madeleine McCann investigation, don't we? Particularly on the part of British police and investigation authorities. If a lab can produce informative data, even if it is complex and mixed, but they can't interpret it, then you can have tremendous injustice of guilty people not being convicted, of innocent people staying in prison. What is needed is an objective and accurate interpretation that can scientifically resolve the DNA, he said. Dr. Perlin said the modern computational DNA testing methods he has pioneered, known as True Allele, can now unlock that evidence and assist the London Met Police investigation. Considering the testing methods available in 2007, it was no surprise the FSS had failed, Dr. Perlin said. 9.com.au has contacted Operation Grange, the UK's investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, with this information. True Allele has been used successfully in the UK and elsewhere around the world to solve problems just like this, and if the London Met Police want to know the answer, it won't cost them anything. Just send us the data and we will give them the answer. So Mark Perlin has made this offer to the British police. He says he'll test the DNA data and interpret it for them using his advanced methods for nothing. Very generous of him, and I really can't see what reason there could possibly be not to take up this offer. So Dr. Perlin said forensic organizations around the world, such as the FSS and other official UK bodies, routinely hold and archive the data his lab needs to make the analysis. It would be a great way to resolve the case using modern technology and get a definitive answer to at least this one question that perplexed the FSS 10 years ago, he said. FSS methods don't work. In 2016, Dr. Perlin's lab successfully analyzed a remarkably small and complex piece of DNA evidence in a high-profile mass murder trial in Sydney, Australia. The top prosecutor in New South Wales described the sample cracked by cybergenetics as the most challenging DNA evidence that had ever been presented in an Australian courtroom. That DNA evidence was believed pivotal in securing a guilty verdict against Robert Shee after 3 of his earlier murder trials had been plagued by hung juries and aborted for various reasons. So obviously these methods of analyzing the DNA are very impressive, and they have an impressive track record. Dr. Perlin has testified about DNA samples which have been analyzed by cybergenetics hundreds of times in US state, federal, military, and foreign courts. He said cybergenetics had been used in cases just like Madeleine's, where there are complex mixtures, a small amount of DNA, and many contributors. So just the fact that the DNA evidence in Madeleine's case is weak and complex doesn't necessarily hold Dr. Perlin back from being able to analyze it. He believes he can still get fairly accurate results. So cybergenetics was able to separate those mixtures, make a comparison, and reach sound scientific conclusions, Dr. Perlin claimed. Some of the McCann DNA samples which stumped the FSS scientists were very small and had multiple contributors. Portuguese forensics teams had focused on the McCann hire car and certain areas of interest inside the family holiday apartment after intensive search work by 2 specialist cadaver and blood sniffing dogs 3 months after Madeleine went missing. So we've looked at the evidence of the dogs, and the fact that the dog's evidence needs to be corroborated by evidence like DNA evidence. The inconclusive DNA results delivered by the FSS scientists appeared to cast serious doubt over the alerts made by the dogs in potential crime scenes. So the inconclusive results by the FSS made it seem as if the dogs were mistaken, but what Mark Perlin is saying, I keep calling him Mike, he's Mark, Dr. Mark Perlin is saying is that the dogs might be 100% correct. It's just that the FSS did not know how to analyze the DNA properly, or they didn't have advanced enough methods to analyze the DNA. Okay. So this talks more about the impressive track record of cybergenetics and Dr. Perlin. His methods have been used to analyze victims of 9/11. Okay. So in the Maddie podcast, Dr. Perlin explained exactly how modern DNA software can reboot the McCann cold case. Madeleine would be 16 years old in May this year. Portuguese police sent dozens of DNA samples to the FSS in 2007. They lifted floor tiles and took DNA swabs from behind the blue sofa in the lounge of the McCann apartment. Sections of the boot compartment in the Renault Scenic were also cut out and expressed to the FSS. So the McCanns have strenuously denied they were involved in the disappearance of their daughter. Okay. And I think it's also just worth noting at this point, I think this is a good time to mention this again. 9.com.au, who was the news broadcaster that interviewed Dr. Perlin, and Dr. Perlin himself, so both 9.com.au and Dr. Perlin have made the offer to Operation Grange, which is the UK investigation into Maddie's disappearance, about reanalyzing the DNA evidence to see if they can get more accurate results, which Dr. Perlin strongly believes that he can. He's made this offer for free, no cost. And bear in mind, millions of pounds have already been spent on searching for Madeleine McCann. And basically, the response from Operation Grange in the UK has just been complete silence. They have not even had the courtesy to acknowledge Dr. Perlin's very kind offer or to respond to it in any way. And I think if you look at the remit of Operation Grange, you kind of understand why. Operation Grange is an investigation that is only set up to look at the abduction theory. So they are only willing to explore avenues of investigation that confirm that Madeleine was abducted. They're not willing to look at anything outside of that. They're not willing to look at anything which might suggest that Madeleine died in that apartment. And I think that's just a real travesty of justice. And that's where we're sitting at the moment. Christian Bruckner, who's the German suspect that they're currently trying to pin the case onto, is still yet to be tried for the case. And, you know, here we have someone who could potentially resolve the DNA evidence in the case, offering to analyze it for free. And the British police are just not doing anything, not even responding to this offer. I mean, for all we know, Dr. Perlin's, you know, methods could confirm if an abductor was actually present in the apartment when Madeleine went missing. Like, why would the McCanns and the British police not want to know that? It seems to me that there's no downside to having the DNA retested and reanalyzed with more advanced methods. The only, you know, downside that could possibly come from it, from the you know, is from the McCann side. If the evidence showed that Madeleine died in that apartment and that somehow that the McCanns were involved, if the DNA evidence kind of suggested that, then obviously that would lead the investigation in a whole different direction and it would not look good for the McCanns. And that's the only possible reason that I can think of why they're not taking up Dr. Perlin's offer. Let me know what you guys think, what your theories are about that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I will see you in another video, hopefully soon enough. And take care until next time. Bye, everyone.